We all have mentors and role models in our lives that have shared wisdom with us in the outdoors and taught us the things that we know. Lessons from Pop is a place where we can reminisce about those individuals and share those stories. Welcome to the Rust Belt Outdoors. This is a new segment called Lessons from Pop. This will be a recurring segment where we talk to guests about lessons they have learned from a male role model in their life. Could be anybody from a father to a grandfather to an uncle to some guy that they know that took them hunting or fishing or whatever one time and taught them something. These lessons will include a short story that sets how they learned the lesson and actually got it to sink in pretty good. All right, let's get into it. So, the first lesson is actually from myself. This is a lesson that took longer than it should have to learn. I learned this from my dad, and it's a good one. And there's a great story that goes along with it. So we all know when you first start hunting, the first thing everybody tells you is you gotta sit still and don't make any noise if you want to see anything. And that's what I did for a couple of years, and I never really saw anything. And Dad said it was because I was moving around too much, making too much noise. So as I got older and I got to the point where I could actually move around a little bit away from him, I started to do walking, especially during rifle season. Well, only during rifle season at this point in time, I would just walk through the woods. So then he started telling me about how a big buck, or what we would call now a mature buck, will let you walk by them, wait till you're past, and then run out behind you. And I was like, yeah, Dad, whatever. You've been telling me for years that if I move too much or make noise, I'm not going to see anything, period. So you can't tell me now that these deer are just going to let me walk by them, making all this noise, moving around all the time, and they're just going to lay there. Whatever. So he told me this over and over and over again, and I never believed him. It wasn't until a couple of years later, I had to have been 17, 16, 17 at the time, and I shot my first deer with a bow. Well, at that point in time, my brother and I had this deal to this day, still the best deal I've ever made in my life, where I would gut his deer for him and he would drag my deer out. We were hunting a property where we couldn't drive in, and some of the stand sites were a good bit from the access. So, heck yeah, I make that deal any day. So I shoot this doe, I get it gutted. Ben's there, my brother, and he's dragging it out for me. We got a good, I don't know, half mile drag walk. Ben's out in front. Dad and I are behind. We're just walking, talking normal volume, not even like woods volume, just talking to each other about what we'd seen that morning and getting the deer all skinned up once we got home and all that fun stuff. And we were about I could see the vehicles, but we weren't quite close yet. And Ben's probably 50 yards in front of us at this point. We stop at the top of this little rise on the road. Dad lights a cigarette and we're talking. And this little scrub buck jumps up, stares at us for a second, and then takes off out of nowhere. So I chuckled a little bit. And then next thing I know, this just monster. I mean, probably at the time the biggest deer I'd ever seen in the woods. Jumps up right behind him and just takes off. My jaw's on the ground now, and I'm just staring. And I look up at my old man and I go, you've been telling me for years how these big bucks will lay there and let you walk by them and then run out the back door on you. And I never once believed you until now. Uh, Unfortunately, that seems to be how I learn every lesson in life, where I have to have it beat into me or, you know, learn it from a screw up. But hey, that's how life goes sometimes. Dad and I still talk about this to this day, and we joke around about it. And it's, well, like I said, I was 16, 17 years old. So we're talking, 15 years ago. But I will never forget that day. I can still picture the down log that this deer was laying behind. I can still picture Ben up in front of me on the road dragging the doe out. All in all, it was a great day. I mean, like I said, first bow kill, so that was really cool. Dad and I had a pretty cool moment where I got to actually learn a lesson he'd been trying to teach me for however long at that point in time, and just It was an awesome day. Our next lesson comes to us from the man that I was just talking about, my father, David Foulds. He talks about a lesson that his dad, Grouse Foulds, taught him when he first started hunting. At the end of his lesson, he talks about how things have changed from when he began hunting to what he sees today.
Well, I guess it would have to be with about dad. Yes. And reading funnels in the woods, especially between slashes. Because back when I was hunting, we had a lot of big woods. And so dad always taught us to hunt the slashes in between on the edges, whether there be prick or food source or whatever. That's what we always look for. It's where the woods would funnel down from two ridges, and that's usually where we would hunt. And I still do it today. I'll tell you what, we're at Neiltown, and that whole creek runs down through there. And there was a place up there that Dad and my uncle always called the sawdust pile. And where the sawdust pile was, is where it was along the edge of the slashings. I remember it was my first year hunting. And we got in there early, probably a half an hour before daylight. And it was right along the slashing. And at daybreak, a 4 point came out. And I ended up killing that buck. And I killed it with a 20 gauge single barrel with a slug. But we had gone there for probably 8, 10 years, and either Dad or I would both either kill bucks, or he'd kill a buck, or I'd kill a buck. So that was enough for me to prove, yeah, this works. You call it clear cut, I call it slashing. I can tell you the difference between when I started hunting and the hunting today. Back when I first started hunting, which would have been early 70s, mid 70s, I should say, we used to see herds with 100 deer in 'em. And you had a lot more hunters back then than what you do today because of all the private land leases. We didn't have that back then. There was times where you may see a group of 70, 80 deer or more and not a buck in the bunch. They were all doe. Today, with the lease that we're on, you have about a 50-50 shot of it being a buck. Back then, it wasn't like that. We didn't have antler restrictions back then. If it was a fight, we could shoot it. But today there's just so much private land that times have really changed. It the area that we have our lease on back in the 70s, we used to drive that same block, which would probably be 15 miles, and there'd be 50, 60 cars parked around there, and it just dropped right off to you might see 5 or 6 now. Um, yeah, yeah. Things have definitely declined, but I really don't know if they actually did because of all the private land. Because you can't go, hunt like you used to. It used to be started here and just hunt, but there's so much private land that it kind of limits your area for hunting. But yeah, the deer population over the years have dropped off some, In some areas, there's a lot of deer. In other areas, there isn't. I mean, you see a lot of deer getting hit with cars, and a lot of that has to do with private land. You can't hunt them, so, you know, they're nocturnal. They come out and people hit them, especially around the rut.
Our next lesson comes to us from Mark Hutchinson. Mark was on the first episode of the Rust Belt Outdoors talking about muskie fishing and his passion for the outdoors. Mark takes a little bit of a different approach on this lesson, and it's more so applied to life in general than just the outdoors. But we can definitely take from it and increase our fun and adventures that we have outside using it.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this on the drive up. I think the lesson that is just it's just a reoccurring, process in my life is doing a lot with a little. And what I mean by that is, it's something that kind of correlated into, my work life as a landscaper. The first company I worked for, we didn't really have any equipment. A lot of our equipment was duct taped together, old equipment, cheap, doesn't make a lot of money company, and we just kind of were able to compete with other companies around us with next to no equipment. And that's just kind of been, a concept that I've been forced to deal with my entire life. So the way it starts, it came directly from my father, but growing up, we were, poor family, less than well off, And I mean, reasons for that don't really matter right now, but we only had two guns in the family. We had a 20 gauge pump shotgun. I think it's like one of those Remington Model 870s or whatever I'm not too familiar with guns to that degree, but we had that and we had a 30-06. So when deer season would come around, we had a shotgun with slugs and we had a deer rifle, and it was like, my buddies in school, they had that hand me down 308 that was, $10,000 gun, and everybody had nice guns and nice equipment and clothes. And we were just wearing hand-me-down clothes. I think my first several years I was wearing, hunting overalls from the 70s that smelled like it, and we had cheap guns, cheap ammo, and it was just kind of working with nothing practically when you if you look at it comparatively to other people. We always found success, and it was just the success never came from, whether we got a deer or not, or whether we caught a fish or not. It was just the opportunity to spend some time with my father, and he grew up in the 70s and 80s where, life was way different back then, and he didn't really have a lot of one-on-one time with his dad. So he was very proactive in that in my life. Well, fast forward, that same reoccurring lesson of, kind of doing, just making do with what you have. It's not about what somebody else has or worrying about, oh, well, it must be nice. That guy has this really nice bow. This guy's dad bought him this fishing pole. We never, that wasn't something I was allowed to look at life like. It was like, don't worry about what everybody's got. This is what we got. And a funny saying my dad used to say, we all we need. That was just like a funny thing he said. Fast forward, ninth grade two-a-days. I know you remember that and you know
Oh,
where
yeah.
that was. So poor family, dad that works at Sunrise, summertime. How do you think a kid like me might have had to get to two-a-days? You had to walk. Oh, you want to play football? Walk up there. Oh, you want to play football? It's a $50 entrance fee. You better find $50. And that's how I did it. I had to walk from the south side to the north side, and I measured this as an adult. It's 3.3 miles. Imagine being 13, 14. As a freshman, we didn't have lockers, so I had to take my bag, my pads, my helmet, walk all the way up the mountains at 3 o'clock in the morning to get there by 5, to practice two-a-days until 2, 3 in the afternoon to walk home. And that's kind of how it was in that early teenage life. And then I I had made some not so good decisions and kind of had some trouble with the law, and I got in trouble and was on probation at 15, and ended up going and getting a tattoo really young. And I had a girl that was not good for me that I was messing around with. And this may be too much information, but that girl ended up being pregnant when I was in ninth grade. And that was just like the most soul crushing thing at the time. You know, it's because I'm trying to be a hunter, a fisherman, doing all this stuff, and now I have this huge issue in my life that I got to deal with. My dad made me go get a job, so I was actually working illegally at quick fill gas station with a fake name and social security number to provide for this now kid that I'm supposed to be having at 14. And that was just another lesson that my dad, hey, you did this, you got to deal with this. I'm not going to give you the money for that. You don't have any money, but you're man enough to do this stuff. You might want to go, you might want to figure it out, and he never let me drown, but he also never pulled me out of the water until the last second, and fortunately I ended up finding out a year later that it wasn't my kid, and I kind of got to go back to being, a teenager, and I lived the rest of my life, but it's just that valuable, just kind of, doing what you can with what you have concept, just not complaining, just making things happen. That's been the recipe for success my entire life, And, again, I don't view success as, whether you catch a fish or not, whether you make the most money, whether you have the biggest truck. It's just, are you happy with what you're doing in life, And it's as simple as that, really. It's just not, don't be jealous of your neighbor, just do what you can with what you have, and that's just kind of, yeah, that's been the reoccurring lesson of my life. So yeah, been very appreciative to have grown up the way I did, So
All right, I want to thank everybody for listening. I hope you were all able to learn something from these lessons. I know I definitely was. Until next time, remember, take someone outside.